Elena Whitmore stood in the middle of the great hall as every eye in the pack turned toward her, and she knew, before a single word was spoken, that her life was about to break apart. Derek Wren, the man she had called her mate for 3 years, stood a few steps away, with his jaw tight and his eyes cold. The healer beside him held a folded paper, and the silence in the room felt heavier than any shout could have been. "She cannot give me an heir," Derek said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "The healer has confirmed it. She is barren." A murmur rolled through the crowd like a wave hitting rock. Elena felt her chest tighten, but she did not let her face show the storm inside her. She had learned long ago that tears only fed the hunger of people who wanted to see her fall. "You will be released from this pack," the Alpha Elder announced, his voice flat, as if reading a grocery list rather than ending a woman's entire world. "A mate who cannot bear children brings no future to this pack. Elena Whitmore, you are no longer welcome among us." Just like that, 3 years of loyalty, of cooking meals for pack gatherings, of nursing the sick and training the young, were erased. Someone in the back laughed. Someone else whispered the word worthless, and it traveled through the hall faster than fire through dry grass. Elena lifted her chin. She would not let them see her break. "Very well," she said, her voice steady, even though her hands trembled at her sides. "I will go." She turned and walked out of the hall, past rows of people who had once called her friend, past the mother who had taught her to weave baskets, past the children she had once carried on her shoulders during the summer festival. Not one person reached out to stop her. Not one person said a kind word. Outside, the night air was cold, and stars scattered across the black sky like scattered salt. Elena walked until the lights of the pack village disappeared behind her, until the only sound left was her own footsteps on the dirt road, and the distant call of an owl somewhere in the trees. She did not cry until she was completely alone. By morning, word had spread through every corner of the territory. The story changed shape as it moved from mouth to mouth, the way stories always do. By the time it reached the farthest villages, Elena was no longer simply a woman who could not have children. She was cursed, she was broken, she was, in the unkind language of gossip, barren and worthless. She found an old cabin on the edge of the forest, far from the packlands, in territory that belonged to no one in particular. It had been abandoned for years, its roof half caved in, and its door hanging from one hinge, but it was shelter, and shelter was more than she expected to have. She spent the first week simply making it livable, patching the roof with branches and mud, sweeping years of dust from the floorboards, and stuffing cloth into the gaps in the walls to keep out the wind. The villagers nearby, humans who had no idea what she truly was, gave her work washing linens and mending clothes. She did not tell them her story. She simply became a quiet woman who worked hard and asked for nothing. Some of them were kind. Most simply did not notice her at all, which, after the humiliation of the pack hall, felt like a kind of peace. Still, at night, alone in the small cabin, Elena often found herself staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment Derek had said those words in front of everyone. She thought of all the years she had given to that pack, all the meals prepared, all the wounds bandaged, all the nights she had stayed awake, worrying over a sick child who was not even her own. None of it had mattered in the end. The moment she could not fulfill one expectation, everything else was forgotten. She refused to let bitterness swallow her whole, though some nights it came close. Instead, she found small comforts. She began keeping bees in old wooden boxes behind the cabin, learning their patterns, listening to their hum as a kind of music. She planted a garden of herbs and vegetables, coaxing life from soil that had been neglected for years. Slowly, without anyone watching or praising her for it, Elena began to rebuild herself, piece by piece, the way she had rebuilt the cabin. One afternoon in early autumn, while gathering firewood at the edge of the deep forest, Elena heard a sound that did not belong there. It was a low growl, pained and ragged, coming from somewhere behind a fallen tree. Her instincts told her to be careful. Wolves that were not her own could be dangerous, especially wounded ones, but something in the sound made her stop instead of running. She crept closer and found a massive gray wolf lying on its side, a wound along its ribs bleeding into the leaves beneath it. The wolf's eyes, sharp and gold, locked onto hers the moment she appeared. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena could feel the raw power radiating from the animal, even in its weakened state, as if the forest itself had gone quiet out of respect. "I am not going to hurt you," she said softly, kneeling just out of reach. But that wound needs care, or you will not survive the night. The wolf's ears twitched, and for a strange moment it seemed to understand her, though of course any shifter wolf would. It did not attack, it did not run. It simply watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Elena reached slowly into the bag she carried, pulling out strips of clean cloth she used for her own herb bundles. She approached carefully, speaking in a low, calm voice the whole time, the same voice she used to soothe frightened animals and crying children alike. I have seen worse wounds than this, she told him, though her hands were not entirely steady. You will live, if you let me help. The wolf allowed her closer. She pressed a poultice of crushed herbs against the wound, wrapping the cloth carefully around his body, while he lay still, breathing hard but no longer growling. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and studied him. You are not from around here, she said. Your fur is too well kept for a wolf living wild. Someone will be looking for you. The wolf only stared at her, golden eyes unreadable, and Elena felt an odd pull in her chest, something she could not name. She told herself it was simply the natural instinct to care for something wounded and helpless, nothing more. I cannot leave you here, she said finally. Come with me, if you can walk. My home is close. To her surprise, the wolf pushed himself up, wincing, but managing to stand. He followed her slowly through the trees, matching her pace, until they reached the small cabin at the edge of the clearing. Elena opened the door and stepped aside, and after a moment of hesitation, the wolf limped inside. She fed him broth she had been saving for herself, and though he could not speak in his wolf form, he ate carefully from the bowl she set before him, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something unusual in the way he watched her, not with the wariness of a wild animal, but with a quiet, searching curiosity, as if he were trying to understand something about her that even she did not fully understand about herself. For 3 days, Elena cared for the wolf as his wound healed. She changed his bandages morning and evening, brought him fresh water, and sat beside him in the evenings while the fire crackled low in the hearth. She spoke to him the way lonely people speak to animals, telling him small things about her day, about the bees outside, about the herbs she was drying for winter. She did not tell him about the pack haul, about Derek, about the word that had followed her out of her old life like a shadow. Some wounds, she had learned, healed slower when spoken aloud. On the 4th night, as she sat mending a torn shirt by candlelight, she noticed the wolf watching her with unusual focus. His breathing had changed, his body tensing in a way that made her set the shirt aside. What is it? She asked, leaning forward. Are you in pain? The wolf let out a low sound, almost like a sigh, and then, before her eyes, his form began to shift. Fur receded into skin, bones reshaped themselves with a series of quiet, controlled movements, until where the wolf had lain, a man now sat instead, breathing hard, one hand pressed to the bandage at his ribs. Elena scrambled back in surprise, though she quickly steadied herself. She had grown up among shifters after all. The sight was not entirely foreign to her. But something about this man, even wounded and weary, carried an unmistakable presence, a quiet authority in the way he held himself despite his injury. Forgive the intrusion, he said, his voice deep and low, carrying a calm that did not match the sharp look in his eyes. I did not intend to stay in your home this long, but I was in no condition to travel.
You could have told me you were able to shift, Elena said, gathering her composure.
I have been feeding a man broth meant for wolves. A faint, unexpected smile crossed his face. You fed me with more kindness than most would offer a stranger, wolf or man. I am grateful. Elena studied him carefully in the candlelight. His dark hair was damp with sweat, and there was a scar along his jaw that spoke of old battles, but his eyes held something else entirely, a sharpness that suggested he was used to being obeyed, used to command, though he wore no mark of rank that she recognized. You are not from any pack near here, she said. Your bearing is too different. Who are you? He studied her for a long moment before answering, as if weighing how much to share with a woman who had shown him nothing but generosity while asking nothing in return. My name is Kale, he said simply. I was traveling through unfamiliar territory when I was ambushed by a group of rogue wolves. I fought them off, but not without cost. He gestured to his side. I did not expect to owe my life to a stranger in the woods. You do not owe me anything, Elena said, standing to fetch him fresh water. Any decent person would have done the same. Not every person is decent, Cale replied quietly, and something in his tone made Elena pause, as if he understood more about disappointment and betrayal than his calm demeanor suggested. She handed him the water and sat back down across from him, curiosity beginning to outweigh caution. You should rest. Whatever business brought you into this forest can wait until your strength returns. Cale inclined his head in agreement, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, taking in the quiet strength in the way she moved, the calm confidence in her voice despite living alone in a small cabin far from any pack. He did not know her story yet, but he sensed, with the instinct of a man who had led others his entire life, that this woman carried more weight on her shoulders than she let show. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters gently, and the fire crackled on, casting warm light across two strangers who did not yet know how deeply their paths were about to intertwine. Neither of them could have guessed, in that quiet cabin at the edge of the forest, that the woman the world had called worthless had just saved the life of the most powerful alpha king in the land, a man who was about to see in her exactly what everyone else had failed to see. For now, though, there was only the fire, the food, and the strange, quiet comfort of two people who had both learned, in different ways, what it meant to be underestimated. Morning light spilled through the cracked shutters of the cabin, and Elena woke to the smell of something unexpected, smoke from a fire that had been built up higher than she had left it, and the quiet sound of someone moving carefully around her small kitchen. She sat up quickly, reaching instinctively for the knife she kept beside her bed, before she remembered the events of the night before. Cale stood near the hearth, favoring his injured side, but managing well enough, stirring a pot of the same herbs she used for tea. He looked up when she entered the main room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. You should be resting, Elena said, crossing her arms, not tending my fire. I have never been good at sitting still while someone else works, Cale replied, a faint smile touching his mouth. Consider it a small repayment for your kindness. Elena studied him for a moment, noting the color that had returned to his face overnight, the steadiness in his stance despite the bandage still wrapped around his ribs. Whatever training had shaped this man, it had given him a resilience that few people possessed. You heal quickly, she observed, moving to check his bandage, despite his protest that he was capable of managing it himself. Good blood, he said simply, and something in the way he said it made her wonder again exactly what rank he held among his own kind, though she did not press the question. She had learned, through hard experience, that people revealed themselves in their own time, and pushing too hard only made them retreat further into silence. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. Cale, though his side still ached, insisted on helping with small chores around the cabin, chopping firewood with careful movements that avoided straining his wound, repairing the door that had hung crookedly on its hinge since Elena first arrived. Elena, in turn, continued tending his injury and sharing simple meals with him each evening, the two of them talking by firelight about small, ordinary things. He asked about her bees, and she found herself explaining, with more enthusiasm than she expected, how the hive worked together, how even the smallest bee had a role that mattered to the survival of the whole colony. You speak of them the way some speak of family, Cale observed one evening, watching her closely. Perhaps because they are the only family I have left, Elena said before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the honesty in her voice. Cale did not press further, but something shifted in his expression, a quiet attentiveness that told her he had noticed the weight behind her words, even if he chose not to ask directly. Instead, he simply nodded, as if filing the information away with care rather than curiosity. It was in the village, several days later, that Cale first heard her story in full. He had gone, against Elena's mild protest, to help her deliver mended clothing to a family at the edge of the settlement, wanting to stretch his healing body and see more of the place that had sheltered him. While Elena spoke with the family inside their home, two women stood near the well outside, unaware that the tall stranger walking nearby could hear every word of their conversation. That is the one woman said, nodding toward the house Elena had just entered. The Barren one, cast out by her own pack. Word is her mate declared her worthless in front of the whole hall. Shameful, really, the other replied, though there was more curiosity in her tone than sympathy. A woman like that, unable to bear children. No wonder they sent her away. What use is she to any pack now? Cale's jaw tightened, though he said nothing, standing quietly in the shade of a tree until the women moved on, unaware they had been overheard. When Elena emerged from the house a short while later, she found him waiting, his expression unreadable. "You heard them," she said, reading the tension in his shoulders immediately. "I did," Cale admitted, not bothering to pretend otherwise. Elena straightened her spine, bracing herself for the pity or judgment she had grown used to receiving from anyone who learned the truth. "Then you know why I live alone, at the edge of a forest that belongs to no one. You know why I have no pack to call my own." "I know what they said," Cale replied evenly. "I do not know that it is true, and even if it were, I fail to see how it changes anything about the woman who has cared for me these past days, with more grace than most people show their own kin." Elena blinked, caught off guard by the steadiness in his response. She had expected many reactions from him: curiosity, awkward silence, even quiet withdrawal, the way most people responded once they learned her history. She had not expected simple, unwavering acceptance. "Most people do not feel that way," she said quietly, resuming their walk back toward the cabin. "Most people are foolish," Cale said, matching her pace. "A person's worth is not measured by one single thing, no matter how much others wish to reduce them to it. I have known warriors who could not fight, healers who could not heal their own wounds, leaders who could not lead their own hearts. None of that erased what they offered the world in other ways." Elena said nothing for a long moment, unsure how to respond to words that felt, for the first time in years, like they were seeing her, rather than simply looking through her. "You speak as though you understand something about being reduced to one flaw," she said finally. Cale's expression grew distant for a moment, the kind of look that spoke of old burdens carried quietly. Every leader is reduced to their failures eventually, no matter how many victories came before. It is the nature of those who watch from a distance. They remember the one time you stumbled, not the 100 times you stood strong. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the kind that did not need filling, and Elena found herself, for the first time since the night in the pack hall, feeling something loosen in her chest, something she had not realized she had been holding so tightly. That evening, as Cale sat mending a fishing net Elena had shown him how to weave, a distant howl echoed through the forest, sharp and urgent, followed by several answering calls. Cale's entire body went rigid, his eyes sharpening in a way Elena had not seen before. The calm, easy companion of the past few days, replaced instantly by something far more alert and commanding. "They have found me," he said quietly, setting the net aside, and rising to his feet, despite the ache still lingering in his side. "Who has found you?" Elena asked, standing as well, her instincts immediately on guard. Before Cale could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps reached the cabin, careful and coordinated, the kind of movement that spoke of trained soldiers rather than wild animals. Elena reached for the knife she kept near the door, positioning herself instinctively between Cale and the entrance, though she barely knew this man well enough to explain why the impulse felt so natural. "Stand down," Cale said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They are mine." The door opened before Elena could ask what he meant, and 3 men entered, dressed in dark, well-made armor that bore an insignia Elena did not recognize, a crest of a wolf beneath a crown, stitched in silver thread. The lead man, tall and broad-shouldered, dropped immediately to one knee the moment his eyes found Cale. "Your Majesty," he said, relief evident in his voice. "We feared the worst when you did not return." Elena felt the floor shift beneath her, though she had not moved an inch. "Your Majesty." The words echoed strangely in the small cabin, out of place among the herb bundles and mended nets and simple wooden furniture she had built with her own hands. She turned slowly to look at Cale, who met her gaze with something that looked almost like an apology. "You told me your name was Cale," she said carefully. "You did not mention you were a king." "I did not lie," he said quietly. "Cale is my name. King is simply a title that comes with it." The soldier who had spoken rose to his feet, glancing between his king and the woman standing protectively near him, clearly recalculating whatever assumptions he had walked in with. "Forgive the intrusion," the soldier said to Elena, though his eyes remained watchful. We have searched every territory for 3 days. The Packlands have been in an uproar since Alpha King Kale disappeared without word. Elena's mind raced to catch up with the sudden shift in reality. The wounded wolf she had nursed back to health, the quiet man who had helped mend her door and asked thoughtful questions about her bees, was in truth the ruler of territory far larger and more powerful than the pack that had cast her out. The realization settled over her slowly, heavy and strange. "You should have told me," she said, though there was no anger in her voice, only a kind of tired disbelief. "Would it have changed how you cared for me?" Kale asked quietly, stepping closer, ignoring the presence of his guards for a moment, as though they were the only 2 people in the room. Elena considered the question honestly. "No," she admitted. "I suppose it would not have." "Then perhaps it did not need to be told sooner," Kale said, though his eyes carried a weight that suggested he understood the position his silence had placed her in, now that the truth had arrived, uninvited, into her small and carefully rebuilt world. Outside, the forest had gone quiet, as if even the wind understood that something significant had shifted in the small cabin at its edge, something that would soon ripple far beyond the trees that had, until now, kept Elena hidden from a world that had once discarded her without a second thought. The guards waited outside while Kale remained in the cabin a while longer, though the ease that had settled between him and Elena over the past days now carried a new tension, the weight of rank suddenly standing between them like an uninvited guest. Elena busied herself gathering the herbs she had used to treat his wound, needing something to do with her hands, while her mind worked through the shift in everything she thought she understood. "You will need to travel back to your territory," she said finally, not looking up from the bundle she was tying. "Your people have been searching for days. They will want their king returned safely." "They will," Kale agreed, watching her carefully. "But I find I am not eager to leave without understanding something first." Elena finally met his eyes. "Understanding what?" "Why a woman who has been cast aside by her own kind, treated as though she carries no value, still moved without hesitation to protect a wounded stranger in her home, the moment danger appeared at her door." His voice was quiet, but there was genuine curiosity in it, not the polite curiosity of someone making conversation, but the focused attention of a man trying to solve something that mattered to him. "Because it was the right thing to do," Elena said simply. "Whatever happened to me does not change what I believe is right." Kale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Most people, once wounded as deeply as you have been, close themselves off from the world, rather than continue giving to it. "Perhaps I am foolish then," Elena said, though there was no self-pity in her tone, only quiet honesty. "Perhaps you are simply stronger than most," Kale replied, and the sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Before either of them could say more, one of the guards knocked gently on the doorframe, reminding Kale of the urgency of their return. Kale nodded toward him before turning back to Elena. "I must go," he said, "but I do not intend for this to be the last time we speak." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded, watching as he gathered the small satchel of belongings the guards had brought for him. At the doorway, he paused and turned back. "Thank you," he said, "for treating me as a man in need of care, rather than a king to be flattered. It has been a long time since anyone offered me that." Then he was gone, disappearing into the trees with his guards, leaving Elena standing alone in the quiet cabin that suddenly felt larger and emptier than it had in weeks. Word of the Alpha King's brief disappearance and his rescue by an unnamed woman living at the forest's edge spread quickly, though the full truth of who that woman was remained unknown to most, since Kale's guards had been careful not to reveal her name. Still, rumors traveled the way they always did, twisting and growing with each retelling, until the story of a mysterious healer who had saved the king's life became a common tale told in taverns and marketplaces across the region. Elena tried to return to her ordinary routine, tending her bees, mending clothes for the villagers, harvesting the last of her herb garden before the frost set in. But something had shifted inside her that she could not quite name, an unfamiliar warmth that lingered whenever she thought of the quiet evenings she had spent talking with Kale by the fire, the way he had looked at her as though her worth was not something to be measured or questioned. She told herself it did not matter. He was a king, ruler of a territory far more powerful than anything she had ever known, and she was a woman the world had labeled worthless. Whatever brief connection had formed between them in the isolation of her cabin belonged to circumstance, not to any future that made sense. Kings did not return for women who had been cast out by their own kind. And yet, 3 weeks later, as autumn deepened into the first bite of winter, Elena heard the sound of horses approaching her cabin, more than the 3 guards who had come before. She stepped outside to find a small procession waiting at the edge of the clearing, banners bearing the same wolf and crown crest she had seen stitched into the guard's armor, and at the front of it, dismounting from a dark horse with quiet confidence, stood Cale himself. "You came back," Elena said, unable to hide the surprise in her voice. "I told you I would," Cale replied, walking toward her, while his escort remained a respectful distance behind. "Though I imagine you did not fully believe me." "Kings have many responsibilities," Elena said carefully. "I assumed those responsibilities would fill whatever space I once occupied in your thoughts." "They have tried," Cale admitted, a faint, wry smile touching his mouth. "I cannot say they succeeded." Elena felt her heart quicken, despite her attempt to remain composed. "Why have you returned, Cale? Surely a king does not travel this distance simply to check on the health of a stranger's cabin door." "No," he agreed. "I have not come merely to check on a door." He paused, glancing briefly at the escort waiting behind him, before returning his full attention to her. "I have come because I have not been able to stop thinking of the woman who nursed a wounded stranger back to health without knowing his name or his rank, who spoke to me with more honesty in a handful of days than most of my own court has offered in years." Elena's breath caught, though she tried to keep her expression steady. "Cale, I do not know what you are asking." "I am not entirely certain myself," he admitted, his voice softer now, stripped of the formal authority she had heard him use with his guards. "I only know that returning to my territory without knowing more about you felt like leaving something important unfinished." They stood in silence for a moment, the cool autumn wind moving through the trees around them, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant smoke. Elena searched his face for any sign of pity or performance, the kind of hollow gesture powerful men sometimes made toward those beneath them, but she found none, only quiet, genuine interest, the same steady attention he had shown her from the very first night in the cabin. "I am not the kind of woman kings court," she said finally, voicing the fear that had been sitting heavy in her chest since the moment his guards had knelt before him weeks earlier. "You know what they call me. Barren. Worthless. My own pack discarded me for it." "I know what small, frightened people call you," Cale said, his voice firm now, carrying the same quiet authority she imagined he used when addressing his own court. "I do not put much stock in the judgments of those who measure a person's entire worth by one narrow expectation." "Easy words for a king to say," Elena replied, though there was no bitterness in it, only honest doubt. "Then let me offer more than words," Cale said. "Allow me to visit, to know you properly, beyond the circumstances that first brought us together. If, after that, you find nothing in me worth your trust, I will return to my territory and trouble you no further." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk of hope against years of learning to expect disappointment. Yet something in his steady gaze, in the memory of quiet evenings spent talking honestly by firelight, made the risk feel different this time, less like foolishness, and more like the first real chance she had been given in years, to be seen as more than a single failure. "Very well," she said finally. "You may visit." The faint smile that crossed Cale's face in response held more warmth than any grand declaration could have offered, and as his escort prepared to make camp nearby for the evening, Elena found herself, for the first time in a long while, looking toward the future with something other than quiet resignation. Whatever this strange connection was becoming, it had already begun to plant seeds of change in a life she had believed was permanently settled into solitude, and neither of them yet knew how far those roots would grow, or how many storms would test them before they found solid ground. Cale stayed 3 days that first visit, though he did not stay within the cabin itself, choosing instead to make camp a respectful distance away with his small escort. Each morning he arrived at her door with some small offering, wildflowers he had gathered along the ride, a rare tea blend from his own territory, once even a jar of honey he claimed came from hives finer than hers, a comment that earned him a raised eyebrow and a challenge to prove it, which he happily accepted, and just as happily lost. Their days together fell into an easy pattern. Elena continued her work, and Cale, despite the protests of his guards who worried over a king performing manual labor, insisted on helping wherever he could, chopping wood, repairing fences, learning the careful rhythm of tending bees without disturbing them. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. His childhood spent training for a throne he had not asked for. Her years spent building a life from nothing, after everything familiar had been stripped away. "You never speak of your mate," Kale said one evening, choosing his words carefully. "The one who called you Barren before your entire pack." Elena's hands stilled over the mending in her lap. "There is little to say. Derek and I were paired young, as many are. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that what we shared went beyond duty. When the healer confirmed I could not carry children, he did not hesitate to end things in the most public way possible." "That was not foolishness," Kale said quietly. "That was simply hope, and hope should never be mistaken for weakness." Elena looked up at him, surprised, as she often was, by how easily he offered her grace where others had offered judgment. "You speak as though you understand loss like that." "I understand what it is to be valued for one purpose alone," Kale said, his voice growing distant. "My own father raised me to believe my worth lay entirely in my ability to lead, to conquer, to expand our territory. When I questioned that path as a young man, wanting instead to understand the people I would one day rule, rather than simply command them, he made it clear such thoughts made me weak in his eyes." "And yet you rule now with more compassion than most kings I have heard of," Elena said. "Because I decided long ago that a single narrow measure would not define the kind of leader, or the kind of man, I chose to become," Kale replied, meeting her eyes steadily. "The same choice, I think, that you have made every day, since your own pack tried to reduce you to one flaw." Word of the king's frequent visits to the isolated cabin eventually reached his own court, and it was not long before it traveled further still, back toward the very pack lands that had cast Elena out. Derek Wren, now paired with a new mate chosen for her proven fertility, heard the rumors with a mixture of disbelief and simmering resentment. The idea that the woman he had publicly humiliated might now hold the interest of the most powerful alpha king in the region unsettled him in ways he did not fully understand himself. He arrived at Elena's cabin, unannounced on a gray afternoon, when Kale had returned briefly to his own territory to attend to matters of state. Elena was hanging herbs to dry along the eaves when she heard the sound of an approaching horse and turned to find Derek dismounting at the edge of her clearing, his expression carrying the same false confidence she remembered from their years together. "Elena," he said, as though greeting an old friend, rather than a woman he had discarded in front of her entire community. "I heard rumors I could hardly believe. The Alpha King, visiting you here." "What do you want, Derek?" Elena asked, her voice cool, betraying none of the discomfort his sudden appearance stirred in her. "I simply wish to see for myself whether the rumors held truth," he said, glancing around the small but well-kept cabin and garden with an expression that suggested surprise at how far she had come from the broken woman he remembered leaving in the pack hall. "It seems you have done well for yourself, considering the circumstances." "Considering the circumstances you created," Elena corrected sharply. Derek's jaw tightened at the reminder, though he quickly smoothed his expression back into practiced calm. "I did what was necessary for the good of the pack, Elena. You understand that." "I understand that you found it easier to discard me publicly than to stand beside me privately," Elena replied. "There is a difference between necessity and cruelty, Derek, though I imagine you have never had reason to learn it." Something flickered across his face, perhaps shame, though it was gone too quickly for her to be certain. "If there is any truth to what I have heard, if the king truly intends to elevate you to a position of importance, I hope you will remember where you came from, and perhaps remember old friends kindly when you rise." Elena felt a cold clarity settle over her, understanding immediately the true purpose behind his visit. He had not come out of concern or curiosity. He had come hoping to secure some future advantage, some connection to power, should the rumors prove true. "You were never a friend to me, Derek," she said quietly. "You were a mate who valued me only for what I could not give you, and abandoned me the moment that value seemed uncertain. Whatever becomes of my future, know that it owes nothing to you, and it will offer you nothing in return." Derek's expression hardened, the false warmth dropping away entirely. "You would do well to remember, Elena, that a king's interest can shift as quickly as it arrives. Do not become so confident in a position that was never promised to last. Perhaps, Elena said, holding his gaze without flinching. But even if it does not last, I will have known, at least once, what it feels like to be seen as more than a single failure. That is more than you ever offered me. Derek said nothing further, mounting his horse and riding away without a backward glance, leaving Elena standing alone in the quiet clearing, her heart pounding, not with sadness, but with a fierce, unfamiliar strength. She realized, watching him disappear down the path, that his words no longer held the power over her they once had. Somewhere in the past weeks, without fully noticing it happen, she had begun to reclaim the sense of worth he and the rest of her old pack had tried so thoroughly to strip away. When Cale returned a few days later and Elena told him of Derek's visit, his expression darkened in a way she had not yet seen. The calm, gentle man she had come to know, replaced briefly by something sharper, more protective. He had no right to trouble you, Cale said, his voice tight with restrained anger. He did not trouble me, as much as he once might have, Elena replied honestly. If anything, his visit reminded me how far I have come since that night in the pack hall. Cale studied her for a long moment, something like admiration softening the tension in his expression. You continue to surprise me, Elena Whitmore. Most would have been shaken by such a visit. You seem only strengthened by it. I have had a great deal of practice rebuilding myself from nothing, Elena said, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. It seems I am finally becoming skilled at it. Cale reached for her hand then, a small, simple gesture, yet one that carried more weight than any grand declaration could have. Then let me be part of what you continue to build, Elena. Not because you need rescuing, for I have seen with my own eyes that you need no rescue at all, but because I find myself wanting to stand beside the life you are creating, rather than simply visiting the edges of it. Elena looked down at their joined hands, then back up into his steady golden eyes, and felt, for the first time since the night everything had been taken from her, that the future might hold more than mere survival. It might hold something worth truly hoping for. Winter settled fully over the region by the time Cale returned once more to Elena's cabin, this time accompanied by a larger escort than before, and a formal envoy dressed in the deep blue and silver colors of his royal house. Elena noticed the shift immediately, the careful formality in the way the envoy carried a sealed scroll, the way Cale himself seemed slightly more restrained than his usual easy warmth, as though bracing himself for something significant. Elena Whitmore, the envoy began, unrolling the scroll with practiced ceremony. By the will and word of Alpha King Cale, of the Northern Wolf Territories, you are formally invited to consider a proposal of marriage, elevating you to the position of queen, should you accept. Elena stood frozen for a moment, the formal words feeling strangely distant, as though they belonged to someone else's life rather than her own. She looked past the envoy to Cale, searching his face for reassurance amid the sudden weight of ceremony. This is not how I intended to ask, Cale said, stepping forward once the envoy had finished, a faint, almost embarrassed smile touching his mouth. My counsel insisted on the formal presentation. I would have preferred simply asking you myself, without the scroll and the ceremony. Then ask me yourself, Elena said softly, her heart pounding. Cale took her hands gently in his, the formal envoy and escort fading into the background as far as either of them were concerned. Elena, I have known you only a handful of months, yet in that time, you have shown me more honesty, more strength, and more genuine kindness than I have encountered in a lifetime surrounded by court and ceremony. I do not ask you to become my queen because it would please my council, or because tradition demands a king take a mate. I ask because I cannot imagine building the future of my territory without you standing beside me, sharing in both its burdens and its joys. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, though for the first time in years, they were not born of pain or humiliation. Cale, you know what they will say. You know the whispers that will follow me into your court, the same cruel words that followed me out of my own pack. Let them whisper, Cale said firmly. I did not fall for the opinions others held of you, Elena. I fell for the woman who nursed a wounded stranger, without knowing his rank, who rebuilt an entire life from nothing after being discarded, who speaks truth, even when silence would be easier. That woman is who I wish to stand beside as my queen, regardless of what small minds choose to say. Elena searched his eyes for any hint of hesitation, any shadow of doubt, and found none, only steady, unwavering certainty. Slowly, the fear that had gripped her chest since the envoy first began speaking began to loosen, replaced by something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time: genuine hope for a future, built on being truly seen, rather than merely tolerated. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the tears now falling freely. "Yes, Kale, I will be your queen." The escort erupted into quiet, respectful applause, and even the formal envoy allowed himself a small, genuine smile at the sight of his king's evident joy. Kale pulled Elena into an embrace, the formal ceremony momentarily forgotten in favor of simple, honest happiness. News of the engagement spread quickly through both territories, though the reactions could not have been more different depending on where the news landed. In Kale's own kingdom, many among the common people welcomed the news with genuine curiosity, having heard the growing rumors of a mysterious healer who had saved their king's life and captured his heart in equal measure. Among the nobility and council, however, the reaction proved far more complicated. Kale's advisors, though loyal, expressed quiet concern over a match formed so quickly, with a woman whose history included public rejection by her own pack. Some worried over the political implications, the perceived weakness of a king choosing a mate without the backing of an established, powerful family. Others, more bluntly, worried over the same issue that had driven Derek to cast Elena aside in the first place: the question of whether she could provide an heir to secure the future of the kingdom. Among these concerned voices, none proved more vocal, nor more dangerous, than Vivian Ashcombe, Kale's cousin, and a woman who had long harbored quiet ambitions regarding the throne herself, believing her own bloodline held stronger claim than the current line of succession allowed. Vivian received news of the engagement with carefully controlled fury, recognizing immediately the threat it posed to any future plans she might have nurtured in the shadows of the court. "A woman cast out for infertility," Vivian said to her closest confidant, a minor lord named Cedric, who had long supported her ambitions in exchange for promised favors, elevated to queen. "The council will never allow such instability to stand unchallenged." "The king seems quite determined," Cedric replied cautiously. "Public opinion among the common folk has already begun to favor the match, given how the story of their meeting has spread." "Public opinion can be shaped," Vivienne said coldly, "provided the right seeds are planted at the right time. This Elena Whitmore's past provides ample material to work with, should the need arise to remind the court, and the kingdom, why such a match threatens the very stability of our future." Back at the cabin, unaware of the storm quietly building within Kale's court, Elena spent the following weeks preparing for the journey to her new home, saying careful goodbyes to the small village that had sheltered her during her exile, tending her bees and garden one final time, before entrusting their care to a kind neighboring family who had grown fond of her over the months. Kale visited as often as his duties allowed, and together they discussed the practicalities of the coming transition, though neither of them yet knew how quickly those practical concerns would be overshadowed by the challenges awaiting Elena within the walls of the royal court. "You will face resistance," Kale warned her honestly, one evening, as they sat together, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and violet. "Not all within my court will welcome you as readily as I have. Some cling tightly to tradition, and others, I fear, may cling to ambitions of their own." "I have faced worse than court gossip," Elena said, though a flicker of old anxiety crossed her expression. "Still, I would rather know the truth of what awaits me than walk in blind." "You will never walk in blind, not while I stand beside you," Kale promised, taking her hand firmly in his. "Whatever resistance arises, know that my choice remains unshaken. You are not simply my intended queen, Elena. You are the truest partner I have found in this life, and I intend to defend that truth against anyone who seeks to challenge it." Elena leaned into him, drawing strength from his steady presence, though a quiet unease still lingered in the back of her mind. She had learned, through painful experience, that even the strongest declarations of loyalty could crumble under enough pressure. Whether Kale's promise would hold firm against the challenges of a royal court determined to protect its own interests remained to be seen. But for now, beneath the fading light of a winter sunset, Elena allowed herself to believe, cautiously, that this time might be different. The journey to Kale's kingdom took 3 full days, winding through forests and hills that grew steadily more grand as they approached the royal territory, until at last, The towering stone walls of the capital rose into view, banners bearing the wolf and crown crest snapping proudly in the winter wind. Elena had prepared herself as best she could for the sight, yet nothing quite matched the reality of the massive gates, the bustling streets filled with merchants and citizens, all of it a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of the forest cabin she had called home for so long. Word of her arrival had clearly traveled ahead of them, as crowds gathered along the main road leading to the castle, curious faces watching as the procession passed. Some offered warm smiles, having heard the romantic tale of the healer who saved their king's life. Others watched with cool, assessing eyes, clearly having heard different versions of her story, versions shaped by whispers rather than truth. Inside the castle walls, Elena was given a suite of rooms, finer than anything she had ever imagined, with tall windows overlooking the courtyard gardens below, though the grandeur did little to settle the nervous energy building in her chest, as she prepared to meet Kale's full council for the first time that evening. The council chamber, when she entered on Kale's arm, fell into a silence that carried an unmistakable edge of scrutiny. A dozen advisors and nobles sat around a long table, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. At the head of the opposing side sat Vivian Ashcombe, elegant and composed, her sharp eyes studying Elena with the careful attention of someone assessing a rival rather than welcoming a future queen. "Council," Kale began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, "allow me to formally introduce Elena Whitmore, soon to be my queen." A murmur passed through the room, polite on the surface but carrying an undercurrent of tension. One older advisor, a stern man named Lord Halden, rose from his seat with careful formality. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing Kale directly, "the council welcomes any choice you make with genuine respect. However, given the importance of securing the succession, might we ask what assurances exist regarding Lady Whitmore's ability to provide an heir?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Elena felt every eye in the room shift toward her, waiting for her reaction. She had known this moment would come eventually, yet feeling the weight of it in person proved far heavier than she had anticipated. "That question," Kale said, his voice hardening slightly, "is neither appropriate nor relevant to this introduction." "With respect, Your Majesty," Lord Halden pressed, though his tone remained carefully measured. "The stability of the kingdom depends on clear succession. It is a fair concern for this council to raise." Elena drew a steady breath, choosing to speak for herself, rather than allow Kale to fight this particular battle alone. "I understand the council's concern," she said, her voice calm, despite the racing of her heart. "I will not pretend the circumstances surrounding my departure from my former pack are unknown to this room. I was told, by a healer I trusted at the time, that I could not bear children. Whether that diagnosis remains accurate, I cannot say with certainty, as I have had no reason since to seek further examination." The honesty in her answer seemed to catch several members of the council off guard, having perhaps expected either defensive denial or tearful apology, neither of which Elena offered. "What I can say," she continued, "is that my worth, and my ability to serve this kingdom well, does not begin and end with that single question. I have spent years building something from nothing, caring for those around me without expectation of reward, and learning strength in circumstances that would have broken many. If given the chance, I intend to bring that same dedication to this kingdom and its people." A quiet pause followed her words, and to Elena's surprise, several of the council members exchanged approving glances, clearly having expected less composure from the woman rumor had painted as broken and desperate. Even Lord Halden inclined his head slightly, though his expression remained cautious. Vivian, however, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, recognizing that Elena's honest, steady response had done more to win over the room than any denial could have accomplished. This realization only deepened her resolve to find another avenue of attack. Over the following weeks, as preparations for the royal wedding began in earnest, Elena worked hard to settle into her new life, learning the customs and expectations of court, while continuing to visit the kitchens and gardens where she felt most at home, much to the surprise of the castle staff, who had not expected their future queen to show such genuine interest in their daily work. Slowly, through small, consistent kindnesses, Elena began winning over hearts among the household staff, even as certain corners of the noble court remained coldly distant. Vivian, watching this quiet growth of support with increasing unease, began her own quiet campaign of sabotage, though careful never to act in ways that could be traced directly back to her. Rumors resurfaced with fresh cruelty, whispered among servants and nobles alike, questioning not only Elena's fertility, but her very intentions, suggesting she had somehow manipulated the king through cunning, rather than genuine affection. Small items in Elena's chambers occasionally went missing, or were moved without explanation, unsettling her sense of safety within walls that were meant to be her new home. One afternoon, Elena discovered a torn page from what appeared to be an old healer's record, left deliberately on her writing desk, detailing in cold clinical language a supposed examination confirming permanent infertility, dated years before her time with Derek's pack. The paper bore no clear signature or seal, yet its presence alone was clearly meant to unsettle her, to remind her, even within the walls of her new home, of the label she had spent months trying to move beyond. Shaken, Elena brought the paper to Cale that evening, her hands trembling slightly as she explained where she had found it. "This is deliberate," Cale said, his expression darkening as he examined the paper carefully. "Someone wishes to remind you of old wounds, or perhaps hopes to convince you that your past will always define your future here." "It is working, in some small way," Elena admitted quietly, hating the vulnerability in her own voice. "I thought I had made peace with all of this, yet seeing it here, in my own chambers, makes it feel as though I will never truly escape it." Cale took her hands gently, his golden eyes steady with quiet determination. "Whoever is responsible for this will be found, Elena. I will not allow old cruelties to follow you into the life we are building together. But I ask you to remember, the truth of your worth was never dependent on that piece of paper, or on anyone's opinion of it. It rests in the woman you have shown yourself to be, again and again, regardless of what challenges arise." Elena nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence, though a quiet unease continued to linger in the back of her mind. Someone within these walls clearly wished to see her fail, or perhaps wished to see her leave entirely, and as the wedding drew closer, Elena understood she would need to remain vigilant, for the challenges facing her were only beginning to reveal themselves. Cale launched a quiet investigation into the source of the torn healer's record, though weeks passed without a clear answer, the culprit careful to leave no obvious trail. In the meantime, Elena found herself the target of increasingly bold attempts to undermine her position, each one subtle enough to avoid direct blame, yet cumulative enough to wear at her confidence. During a formal dinner honoring visiting dignitaries from a neighboring territory, Elena arrived to find her seat unexpectedly changed at the last moment, placing her at the far end of the table rather than beside Cale, as tradition dictated for an intended queen. When she quietly asked a nearby steward about the change, he seemed genuinely confused, insisting he had received instructions from someone claiming to speak for the king's household, though no such instruction had actually come from Cale himself. Cale noticed the empty seat beside him immediately upon entering the hall and, without hesitation, crossed the room to personally escort Elena back to her rightful place, making the correction in full view of the assembled guests, a clear and public statement that left little room for doubt regarding his commitment to her. "This was no simple mistake," he said quietly to her as they walked back together. "Someone wished to embarrass you before our guests." "I am beginning to understand that clearly," Elena replied, her jaw tight with restrained frustration. "Yet without proof, there is little to be done beyond enduring it." Vivian, watching the exchange from her own seat near the head of the table, offered a look of polite concern that did nothing to mask the satisfaction hidden beneath it. The burrito was cold. Elena caught the brief flicker of triumph in her eyes before it disappeared behind a practiced mask of courtly composure, and in that moment, she understood with certainty exactly where these quiet attacks were originating from, even without solid proof to bring before the council. Rather than retreat from the challenge, Elena chose a different path, one that surprised even Cale in its quiet boldness. Instead of avoiding Vivian, she sought her out directly, requesting a private audience under the guise of discussing wedding preparations, a request Vivian could not easily refuse, without appearing suspicious before the rest of the court. "Lady Ashcombe," Elena said, once they were alone in a quiet sitting room, "I understand you hold concerns regarding my suitability as queen." Vivian's expression remained carefully neutral. "The council has expressed such concerns, yes. It is only natural, given the circumstances." I imagine those concerns run deeper for you than for most of the council, Elena said evenly, watching Vivian's composure flicker ever so slightly. Given your own claim to the succession, should the current line falter? A tense silence stretched between them before Vivian allowed a thin smile to touch her lips. You are more perceptive than the rumors suggested, Lady Whitmore. I have learned, through painful experience, to recognize when someone wishes to see me fail, Elena replied calmly. I do not intend to make it easy for you, Lady Ashcombe, though I would prefer we understand each other honestly, rather than continue this quiet dance of misplaced dinner seats and mysterious documents left upon my desk. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly at the direct accusation, though she offered no confession, only a cool, measured response. I make no claims to understand what documents you speak of. I would advise caution, however, before making accusations you cannot prove within these walls. I have made no accusation, Elena said, holding her gaze steadily. I have simply made clear that I see you, Lady Ashcombe, as clearly as you have been watching me since the day I arrived. The two women studied each other in silence for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them, that further conflict lay ahead, though neither would openly declare it. Elena left the meeting with no confession, no clear victory, yet a quiet confidence had settled into her bearing that had not been there before, the confidence of a woman who no longer intended to shrink from challenges meant to diminish her. Cale, upon hearing of the private meeting, expressed both admiration and concern. You confronted her directly, he said, a mixture of pride and worry, evident in his voice. That is a bold move, Elena, though it may provoke her further. Perhaps, Elena acknowledged, but I have spent enough of my life, allowing others to quietly undermine me from the shadows. I would rather face this threat directly than wait anxiously for the next hidden attack. As the wedding date approached, tensions within the court continued simmering beneath the surface, though no further direct attacks materialized in the following weeks, leading some to hope that Vivian's schemes had been sufficiently deterred. Elena remained cautious, however, sensing that a woman as determined as Vivian would not abandon her ambitions so easily, merely retreat further into more careful, patient planning. During this same period, Elena grew close with several members of the household staff, particularly an elderly healer named Mira, who tended to the castle's medical needs and had served the royal family faithfully for over 3 decades. Mira possessed a quiet wisdom and gentle manner that reminded Elena somewhat of the herbal knowledge she herself had cultivated during her years of exile, and the two women quickly formed a genuine friendship over shared discussions of remedies and treatments. You carry a great deal of tension in your shoulders, my dear, Mira observed one afternoon, as Elena helped her sort dried herbs in the castle's small medical chamber, a task Elena found soothing amid the constant pressure of court life. More than simple wedding nerves, I think. There is much resting on my shoulders these days, Elena admitted, setting aside a bundle of chamomile, more than I anticipated when I agreed to become queen. Mira studied her carefully. The same searching, kind attention Elena remembered from her own days tending wounded creatures in the forest. If it would ease your mind, I would be glad to examine you properly, whenever you feel ready. I understand, there have been questions raised regarding your health, questions that perhaps deserve a more thorough answer than old rumors have provided. Elena hesitated, old fear rising briefly at the suggestion, the memory of standing in the pack hall while a healer's cold pronouncement ended her old life in an instant. Yet something in Mira's gentle, genuine offer felt entirely different from that painful memory, free of judgment or agenda. Perhaps, Elena said slowly, it is time I finally understood the truth for myself, rather than continuing to carry someone else's old verdict. Mira smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand over Elena's own. Whenever you are ready, my dear, I will be here. Sometimes the truth we fear the most turns out to be far different from what we were once told to believe. Elena left the medical chamber that evening with a quiet, unfamiliar mixture of anxiety and hope settling in her chest, uncertain what a proper examination might reveal, yet sensing, for reasons she could not entirely explain, that the answer awaiting her held far more significance than she had allowed herself to imagine. Elena returned to the medical chamber 3 days later, having spent those days quietly gathering her courage, unsure what unsettled her more, the possibility that Mira might confirm the old diagnosis, or the equally frightening possibility that it might prove false, reopening wounds she had worked so hard to close. Mira welcomed her warmly, guiding her through a careful, thorough examination, unlike anything Elena had experienced during her brief and hurried visit with the healer in her old pack years earlier. "The examination your former pack performed," Mira said thoughtfully, reviewing her notes once the process was complete, "sounds, from what you have described, remarkably brief for such a serious and permanent diagnosis." "It was over within minutes," Elena confirmed, memory of that day still sharp despite the years that had passed. "The healer barely spoke with me before delivering his conclusion to Derek and the assembled hall." Mira's expression grew troubled, a furrow forming between her brows as she set aside her notes. "My dear, I want to be certain before I say anything further, but based on what I have found today, I see no clear indication of the permanent condition you were told you carried. There are natural variations in every woman's body, timing that shifts, cycles that differ, none of which alone would justify such a swift and final pronouncement." Elena's heart began to pound, a strange mixture of hope and fear rising in her chest, so quickly it left her slightly breathless. "Are you saying the diagnosis was wrong?" "I am saying," Mira replied carefully, "that I would like to consult further, perhaps bring in a second healer from a neighboring territory whose judgment I trust completely, someone with no connection to your former pack, or to the politics currently surrounding this court. I do not wish to offer false hope, Elena, nor do I wish to dismiss a possibility that could bring you real answers after years of uncertainty." Over the following 2 weeks, Mira arranged for a respected healer named Old Ansel, a quiet, thorough man known throughout the region for his careful and unbiased judgment, to travel to the castle and conduct his own independent examination. Elena endured the process with a strange calm, having already prepared herself, she believed, for whatever answer awaited her. When Ansel finally delivered his findings, seated with Mira and Elena in the quiet privacy of the medical chamber, his conclusion arrived with a gentle but unmistakable clarity. "There is no permanent condition preventing you from bearing children, Lady Whitmore," he said simply. "Whatever the original healer diagnosed, either through error or through some other cause I cannot speak to directly, does not match what I have observed today." Elena sat in stunned silence, the weight of years spent believing herself broken, suddenly lifting in a way she had not expected, leaving behind not simple relief, but a complicated storm of emotions she struggled to name. Anger rose first, sharp and unexpected, at the years stolen from her by a diagnosis that had cost her everything, her pack, her mate, her entire former life, based on what now appeared to be a deeply flawed, or perhaps even deliberately false conclusion. "How could this happen?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. "How could a healer make such an error, one that changed the entire course of my life?" Mira and Ansel exchanged a careful glance before Ansel spoke again, his tone gentle, but direct. "Errors of this magnitude are rare, Lady Whitmore, though not impossible. However, given the swiftness of the original examination you have described, and the immediate, public nature of the pronouncement that followed, I confess I find myself wondering whether error alone explains what occurred." The implication hung heavy in the room. Elena thought back to that night in the pack hall, the healer's cold, hurried words, Derek's readiness to accept the diagnosis without question, almost as though he had expected it, or perhaps hoped for it. A cold suspicion began forming in her mind, one she had not previously allowed herself to consider. When Cale learned of Ansel's findings that evening, his reaction mirrored Elena's own storm of emotions, relief quickly giving way to controlled fury at the possibility that someone had deliberately falsified the original diagnosis, costing Elena years of pain and humiliation. "If this was deliberate," Cale said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Elena had rarely heard from him, "I intend to see the truth uncovered fully, regardless of who is responsible, or how far the consequences must reach." Derek seemed almost relieved by the diagnosis, Elena said slowly, piecing together memories she had not previously examined so closely, as though it gave him an easy path away from our bond, one that placed all blame on me, rather than on any choice of his own. "It is possible," Cale said carefully, "that your former mate sought a convenient reason to end your bond, perhaps already interested in another match, and found a healer willing to provide the justification he needed, whether through bribery or some other pressure." The thought settled heavily over Elena, the pieces of her past rearranging themselves into a far more painful picture than simple medical misfortune. She had not merely been unlucky. She had, quite possibly, been deliberately deceived and discarded by people who valued convenience over honesty, who found it easier to falsely condemn her than to face whatever true reasons lay behind Derek's wandering interests. "I want the truth," Elena said finally, her voice steadying with renewed resolve. "Whatever it costs, whoever it implicates, I want to know exactly what happened that night, and why." Cale took her hands firmly in his own, his golden eyes fierce with quiet determination. "Then we will find it together, Elena. I will send trusted investigators to your former Packlands immediately, to seek out the healer responsible and uncover whatever truth remains buried in that decision." As preparations began for this new investigation, word of Ansel's findings inevitably began to spread quietly through the castle, despite efforts to keep the matter private until further truth could be uncovered. Vivienne, hearing whispers of the development through her network of informants among the household staff, felt her carefully laid plans beginning to unravel, understanding all too well that if Elena's original diagnosis proved false, the strongest weapon in the council's hesitation toward the match would disappear entirely, leaving her own ambitions more vulnerable than ever before. In the quiet of her private chambers that night, Vivienne began considering more drastic measures, understanding that time was quickly running out to prevent Elena Whitmore from securing a position at court that Vivienne had spent years quietly working to claim for herself, or for a bloodline she believed held far stronger claim to the throne than a forest healer with a suddenly uncertain past. Cale's investigators traveled swiftly to Elena's former Packlands, arriving with the full authority of the Alpha King behind them, an authority that made even the most reluctant witnesses reconsider the wisdom of withholding information. Within days, the healer responsible for Elena's original diagnosis, an aging man named Garrow who had long served the Pack in various medical capacities, was located and brought before the investigators for formal questioning. Faced with the weight of royal authority and the clear evidence Ansel had already gathered contradicting his original findings, Garrow's composure crumbled quickly under careful, persistent questioning. He confessed, with visible shame, that Derek had approached him privately in the weeks before the public pronouncement, offering a substantial sum in exchange for a diagnosis that would end the bond quickly and place responsibility clearly upon Elena, sparing Derek any accusation of abandoning his mate without just cause. "He told me he had grown interested in another," Garrow admitted, his voice heavy with regret, "a woman from a neighboring pack whose family offered a stronger alliance. He needed a reason the Pack elders would accept without question, one that would not reflect poorly upon his own character." "And you provided that reason," one investigator said flatly, despite knowing it to be false. "I told myself it changed little," Garrow said, though the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. "She would have struggled regardless, given the political pressures already surrounding an Omega who had not yet borne children after several years bonded. I convinced myself I was simply hastening an outcome that circumstances would eventually force regardless." The confession, once documented and confirmed, was carried swiftly back to Cale's court, along with formal testimony ready to be presented before the full council. Elena received the news with a complicated mixture of vindication and renewed grief, the truth confirming what she had begun to suspect, yet still painful in its clear proof of the depth of Derek's betrayal. "He knew," she said quietly, sitting with Cale in the privacy of her chambers as she absorbed the full weight of the confession. "He knew the diagnosis was false, and he let the entire Pack believe I was the reason our bond failed, simply because it was easier than admitting his own wandering interest." "His cowardice cost you years of unjust suffering," Cale said, anger evident beneath the careful control in his voice. "Justice will be served, Elena, both for Garrow's false testimony and for Derek's role in commissioning it." The formal reckoning came swiftly. Cale, exercising his authority as Alpha King over allied territories, called for a formal hearing that included representatives from Elena's former pack, ensuring the truth would be heard clearly by those who had once condemned her so publicly. Garrow's confession was presented alongside Ansel's independent findings, leaving no room for doubt regarding the falsified diagnosis. Derek, called before the hearing to answer for his role in the deception, offered weak justifications that satisfied no one present, his composure crumbling further as members of his own current pack, including his new mate, learned the full truth of his past deception. The pack elders, faced with undeniable evidence of the injustice done to Elena, issued a formal public acknowledgement of the wrongful accusation, along with an apology extended before representatives of both territories. Elena listened to the proceedings with quiet dignity, feeling, for the first time in years, the full weight of vindication settle over her, though it arrived tangled with lingering grief for the years and relationships lost to a lie she had not deserved to carry. Derek faced formal consequences within his own pack structure, stripped of certain privileges and standing as punishment for his deception, while Garrow was removed from his position as healer, his years of false testimony having permanently damaged the trust his community had placed in him. Vivian, watching these events unfold from the sidelines of the court, understood with growing dread that her strongest weapon against Elena's position had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly, transforming Elena from a woman, burdened by uncertain rumors, into a figure of genuine public sympathy and admiration, praised throughout both territories for the grace and dignity with which she had endured years of injustice. Desperate and increasingly reckless, Vivian made one final attempt to disrupt the upcoming wedding and coronation, quietly spreading a final round of poisonous rumors, suggesting that Elena had somehow orchestrated the entire revelation herself, manipulating events to secure sympathy and position within the court. This final scheme, however, proved to be her undoing. Careful investigation by Cale's most trusted advisors, prompted by the suspicious timing and source of the new rumors, traced the false narrative directly back to Vivian's own household staff, several of whom, faced with formal questioning, revealed the full extent of her involvement in the earlier sabotage attempts as well, including the seating arrangement at the dignitary dinner and the deliberately placed false medical document left in Elena's chambers. Confronted with undeniable evidence before the full council, Vivian's carefully constructed composure finally shattered, her ambitions laid bare before the very court she had hoped to manipulate in her favor. Cale, though it pained him to formally address a member of his own family in such a manner, made clear that her actions constituted a serious betrayal of trust within his court, one that could not go unanswered. "You have used deception and cruelty in an attempt to secure a position that was never yours to claim," Cale said before the assembled council, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Effective immediately, you are stripped of your position within this court and your claim to succession, and you will leave these territories to reflect upon the harm your ambitions have caused." Vivian left the court in disgraced silence, her schemes fully exposed and thoroughly defeated, while the council, having witnessed the full truth of both Elena's unjust past and Vivian's dangerous ambitions, unanimously voiced their support for the upcoming marriage and coronation, any remaining doubts about Elena's suitability as queen thoroughly dissolved by the courage and grace she had shown throughout the ordeal. On a clear winter morning, beneath a sky so blue it seemed to stretch endlessly above the castle towers, Elena Whitmore stood once more before a great hall filled with watching eyes, though this time the atmosphere held nothing of the humiliation she had endured in her former pack's hall so many months before. Instead, warmth and genuine celebration filled the space as Cale placed a delicate silver crown upon her head, formally naming her Queen of the Northern Wolf Territories, before a hall filled with well-wishes rather than cruel whispers. "Rise, Queen Elena," Cale said, his voice carrying with pride and deep affection through the hall, beloved not for what she was told she could or could not provide, but for the strength, wisdom, and compassion she has shown every soul fortunate enough to know her. The hall erupted into genuine, joyful applause, and as Elena rose to meet Cale's proud gaze, she felt the last remnants of the old, painful label finally fall away entirely, replaced by a new truth she had fought hard to reclaim, one built not on the false judgments of others, but on the strength she had carried within herself all along. Spring arrived gently over the Northern Wolf Territories in the months that followed the coronation, and with it came a quiet, steady rhythm to Elena's new life as queen, one that felt increasingly like home, rather than the intimidating, unfamiliar world she had first stepped into months earlier. She continued visiting the castle gardens each morning, often bringing along several new hives she had established along the southern wall, teaching curious young members of the household staff how to tend them properly, just as she once had in the small clearing behind her forest cabin. Her relationship with the council, once marked by cautious skepticism, had transformed into genuine mutual respect. Lord Halden, who had once questioned her suitability so directly during her first council meeting, became one of her staunchest supporters, often remarking to fellow advisors that the kingdom had never seen a queen so genuinely invested in the daily lives and struggles of its common people. Elena made it a regular practice to visit villages throughout the territory, listening directly to the concerns of farmers, healers, and craftspeople, bringing their needs before the council with the same quiet determination she had once used to rebuild her own shattered life. Mira remained a close friend and trusted advisor within the castle, the two women continuing their shared work in the medical chambers whenever Elena's royal duties allowed, blending Elena's forest-taught knowledge of herbs with Mira's decades of formal healing expertise to improve care for the entire household and surrounding villages. News occasionally reached the castle regarding Elena's former pack, now working diligently to rebuild trust after the scandal surrounding Garrow's false diagnosis and Derek's role in commissioning it. Elena felt no desire for further revenge or continued conflict, choosing instead to focus her energy on the life and kingdom she and Kale were building together, though she remained firm in never allowing herself to be diminished again by the cruel judgments that had once defined her. As for whether Elena and Kale would eventually welcome children of their own into their growing family, the future remained open and unhurried, free from the desperate pressure that had once threatened to define Elena's entire worth. Kale made clear, time and again, both publicly and privately, that his love and respect for Elena had never depended on that single question, and the kingdom, having witnessed her strength, wisdom, and genuine care for its people, had come to measure her value by far more meaningful standards than the narrow expectation that had once nearly destroyed her. On quiet evenings, when the demands of court finally settled and the castle grew peaceful beneath the stars, Elena and Kale often found themselves back in familiar territory, sitting together by a fire, much as they had during those first tentative days in the small forest cabin where their story had truly begun. The grandeur of the castle surrounded them now, far removed from that humble beginning, yet the quiet, honest connection between them remained unchanged, the same steady warmth that had first drawn a wounded king to trust a woman the world had cruelly cast aside. "Do you ever think of that first night," Kale asked her one such evening, "when you found a wounded stranger in the forest and chose to help him without knowing who he truly was?" "Often," Elena admitted, resting her head against his shoulder as the fire crackled softly before them. "I think of how easily I might have walked past you, frightened of an unfamiliar wolf in the woods. I am endlessly grateful I did not." "As am I," Kale said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "The world called you worthless, Elena, yet in truth, you have proven to be the single most valuable gift this kingdom, and this king, have ever received." Elena smiled, watching the flames dance before them, feeling the deep, settled peace of a woman who had finally reclaimed every piece of herself that others had once tried to strip away. She thought of the frightened, humiliated woman who had walked alone into the dark forest so long ago, believing her life had ended the moment a single cruel word was spoken against her. That woman, she realized, had never truly disappeared, but had instead grown steadily stronger through every hardship, every quiet act of resilience, until she emerged not as someone broken by the world's judgment, but as a queen who had built her own worth from the ground up, brick by brick, kindness by kindness, refusing ever again to let anyone else define the true measure of her value. And so, in the warm glow of a kingdom she had helped build into something better and kinder than it had been before, Elena Whitmore, once called barren and worthless, stood firmly as queen, beloved by her people, cherished by her king, and finally, completely, at peace with the woman she had always truly been.